Hi, this is Huili Wang. Welcome to Cloud Access Security Broker, CASB Fundamentals. In earlier video, we talked about the background of CASB, its definition, and the visibility function of CASB and data protection. In this video, we'll move on to talk about the other part of the control function, threat protection. Threat protection itself is a pretty broad term, and for CASB, for cloud service, we want to focus on three areas: identity and access management, security posture management, and the threat detection and mitigation in cloud computing environment. Identity and access management is the critical part in cloud security. Remember the chart we talked about in earlier video. This is on the shared responsibility between service providers and customers. So regardless of what service mode you choose, user access, identity, and data are the responsibility of a customer. So we talked about the data protection in the last video, and the other part of the critical responsibility is the user access identity. There are several technologies related to identity and access management, Federated ID, and Cloud SSO certificate management, and hardware security module. We'll come to that one by one. One of the most popular technologies in identity and access management is Federated ID. The requirement comes from the situation where, for example, you have your own application, and surely the application includes a bunch of key feature components, depends on your business logic, maybe business components, different functions, and the billing. And one of its, an important one is the account management. At least you will have some basic access control, right? And sometimes the account management is not very much related to your business logic. You would just want to put in place some authentication. You could do it, have that included together in your application, like you write the codes for account registration, creation, and authentication authorization within the application alone. Or alternatively, since it can be decoupled from your entire application logic, you can leverage a third party, we call it ID provider. You can just use that party's existing account management to authenticate and authorize the access to your own application. In that sense, the third party is called ID provider. And for example, Google, Facebook, and the mainstream very popular application who has a pretty comprehensive management in their ID and access. And the application itself is called relying party. So the federated ID is the federation between the identity provider, that's the third party, and yourself or your company, your own application. You don't have to run the account management for yourself. You leverage the third party, the existing one, remotely requesting authentication and authorization from that ID provider. We can have a quick example here. Now I'm trying to log in Evernote. That's a note-taking service. I go to Evernote homepage, and I want to log in there. I do not have a Evernote account, so I will continue with Google. In this case, Google is the identity provider, and Evernote is the relying party. If I continue with Google, I will be prompted with the Google login page. Take note of the URL change here. Now the URL reads like this. So
the URL changed, and because the user is redirected to Google account page with a client ID, the client ID should be the Evernote client ID, and the response type is code, so a code return is required, and the state code is there indicating this specific request. So if I try to make another request, for example, let's try to log in again. And the URL right now is the Evernote URL. If I continue with Google, I will be redirected to the Google OAuth page. And I get the URL and grab the second request URL. It's the same as the general OAuth flow using the OAuth framework for this federated ID authentication. And the client ID should remain the same because it's the same Evernote application that's subscribed to Google's identity provider service, but the state code should be different because the state code indicating the specific request, and each time I open a new session, sending a new request, that should be different to mitigate the threat like cross-site scripting forgery. Using Google or Facebook to manage identity and access authentication authorization is a popular practice for cloud applications or services facing public consumers. But when it comes to business world, things might be different. At least the two major differences. Number one, you are likely to have your own identity management services within your company, though decoupled from applications. And in that sense, it's a third party, but not the exact external third party, just the relatively third party because it's not integrated with application. But still, you want to use your internal identity management services. You might not want Google or Facebook to manage your business accounts. So that's number one difference. And number two, when you do the access, like the Evernote using Google to grant access, you still need to enter the credentials, but that is not a best practice to each time when you access the application, you will enter the credential and pass the credential, get the authentication from identity providers as a separate process. The ideal case is to log in only once and then automatically grant accesses to the different applications. Here comes the technology called SAML that serves this requirement. SAML is sitting between the application and identity provider, either as a separate SAML service or as a plugin within your application to serve this need. When you first time log in the SAML application, the request is passed to the identity provider and the authentication result is returned to your SAML and then to automatically grant access to the different applications. This process is completely transparent to the users. What we just discussed Using Federated ID or SAML SSO is the technology used to authenticate and authorize the request from client side. Now take the other way around. How do we ensure the authenticity on the host side? And here the common technology is certificate management. Let's use Google again as an example to take a look at the certificate. Once a certificate is issued to a website, the URL changed from HTTP to HTTPS. The S here means SSL, and now it's actually upgraded to TSL, but for conventional usage, people continue to call it SSL, and that means the traffic between the client to this website is now encrypted. And in addition to changing from HTTP to HTTPS, there is a small lock icon at the beginning of the URL. If you click the icon, you can see some more information giving the details of the certificate issue party. It's called CA, Certificate Authority. There is a limited number of entities who has the privilege to issue certificate. And if you take a deeper look into that, you can see the certificate issuing party and the validity. There is an expiry date for each certificate. So for operation team, if you are maintaining the hosted application, you must make sure that to always keep the certificate within this validity period, because after expired, the website will not be accessible. And we mentioned encryption. The public key is available in the certificate published there. So this key will be used to decrypt the payload in the communication between the website and the client. From the organization's perspective, the basic task, along with ensure that the certificate is renewed periodically before it's expired. And the other important one is to keep the private key strictly confidential. In that case, HSM, hardware security module, could be leveraged. The technology is to store the private key in the hardware instead of putting that in a soft file format to increase its confidentiality. And along with that, since we mentioned the communication between the website and the client is fully encrypted, and that can prevent man-in-the-middle attack, to prevent exfiltration of data in the payload getting breached. But at the same time, from CASB perspective, if we want to ensure the examination of the payload, we'll have to use another technology called SSL termination in proxy. That is to decrypt the payload for inspection and then re-encrypt it again, and to before the flow is resumed. We'll touch a little bit on this part in the following videos when we talk about the deployment mode. In this video, we just covered the basic functions in identity and access management. We'll continue the discussion in control part, covering threat protection in the next video. So stay tuned and see you next time.